Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl. There are 5 children in this book. Augustus Gloop, a greedy boy. Veruca Salt, a girl who is spoiled by her parents. Violet Beauregard, a girl who chews gum all day long. Mike TV, a boy who does nothing but watch television. And Charlie Bucket, the hero. Chapter 1. Here comes Charlie. These 2 very old people are the father and mother of Mr. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine. And these 2 very old people are the father and mother of Mrs. Bucket. Their names are Grandpa George and Grandma Georgina. This is Mr. Bucket, and this is Mrs. Bucket. And apparently there are images that are supposed to be accompanying these in the book. And the whole of this family, besides Mr. and Mrs. Bucket and Charlie, how do you do, how do you do, how do you do, how do you do, this whole family, the 6 grown-ups, count them, and little Charlie Bucket live together in a small wooden house on the edge of a great town. The house wasn't nearly large enough for so many people, and life was extremely uncomfortable for all of them. There were only 2 rooms in the place altogether, and there was only 1 bed. The bed was given to the 4 grandparents because they were so old and tired. They were tired. They were so tired they never got out of bed. Grandpa Joe and Grandma Josephine on this side, and George and Grandma Georgina on the other. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket and little Charlie Bucket slept in the other room, upon mattresses on the floor. In the summertime, when this wasn't too bad, but in winter it was freezing cold drafts blew across the floor all night and long, and it was awful. There wasn't any questions of them being able to buy a better house or even 1 more bed to sleep in. They were far too poor for that. Mr. Bucket was the only person in the family with a job. He worked in a toothpaste factory, where he sat all day long and at a bench and screwed the little caps onto the tops of the tubes of toothpaste after the tubes had been filled. But a toothpaste cap screwer is never paid very much money, and poor Mr. Bucket, however hard he worked and however fast he screwed on the caps, he was never able to make enough to buy 1/2 of the things that were so large a family needed. There wasn't even enough money to buy a proper food for them all. The only meals they could afford were bread and margarine for breakfast, boiled potatoes and cabbage for lunch, and cabbage soup for dinner. Sundays were a bit better. They all looked forward to Sundays, because then, although they had exactly the same, everyone was allowed a second helping. The Buckets, of course, didn't starve, but every one of them, the 2 old grandfathers, the 2 old grandmothers, Charlie's father, Charlie's mother, and especially little Charlie himself, went about from morning till night with a horrible empty feeling in their tummies. Charlie felt it worst of all, and although his father and mother often went without their own share of lunch or supper so that they could give it to him, it still wasn't nearly enough for a growing boy. He desperately wanted something more to fill and satisfy than cabbage and cabbage soup. The one thing he longed for more than anything else was chocolate. Walking to school in the mornings, Charlie would see great slabs of chocolate piled up high in the shop windows, and he would stop and stare and press his nose against the glass, and his mouth watered like mad. Many times a day he would see other children taking bars of creamy chocolate out of their pockets and munching on them greedily, and that, of course, was pure torture. Only once a year, on his birthday, did Charlie Bucket ever get to taste a bit of chocolate. The whole family saved up their money for that special occasion, and when the great day arrived, Charlie was always presented with 1 small chocolate bar to eat all by himself. And each time he received it on those marvelous birthday mornings, he would place it carefully in a small wooden box that he owned, and treasure it as though it were a bar of solid gold. And for the next few days he would allow himself only to look at it, but never to touch it. Then at last, when he could stand it no longer, he would peel back a tiny bit of the paper wrapping at one corner to expose a tiny bit of chocolate. And then he would take a tiny nibble, just enough to allow the lovely sweet taste of it to spread out slowly over his tongue. The next day he would take another tiny nibble, and so on, and so on. And in this way Charlie would make his sixpenny bar of chocolate, birthday chocolate, last him for more than a month. Now that, my friends, is discipline. But I haven't told you about the one awful thing that tortured little Charlie, the lover of chocolate, more than anything else. This thing for him was far, far worse than seeing slabs of chocolate in the shop windows or watching other children munching bars of creamy chocolate right in front of him. It was the most terrible, torturing thing you could imagine. And it was this. In the town itself, actually within sight of the house in which Charlie lived, there was an enormous chocolate factory. Just imagine that. Oh, no. And it wasn't simply an ordinary enormous chocolate factory either, because some enormous chocolate factories are a dime a dozen. It was the largest and most famous in the whole of the world. It was Wonka's factory, owned by a man called Willy Wonka, the greatest inventor and maker of chocolate that there have ever been. And what a tremendous, marvelous place it was. It had huge iron gates leading into it and a high wall surrounding it, and smoke belching from its chimneys, and strange whizzing sounds coming from deep inside it. And outside the walls, for a half a mile around in all directions, the air was scented with a heavy, rich smell of melting chocolate. Twice a day, on his way to and from school, little Charlie Bucket had to walk right past the gates of the factory. And every time he went by, he would begin to walk very, very slowly, and he would hold his nose high in the air and take long, deep sniffs of that gorgeous, chocolatey smell all round him. Oh, how he loved that smell! And how he wished he could go inside the factory and see what it was like! Mr. Willy Wonka's factory. In the evenings, after he had finished his supper of watery cabbage soup, Charlie always went into his room of his 4 grandparents to listen to their stories, and then afterwards to say good night. Every one of these old people was over 90. They were all shriveled as prunes and bony as skeletons, and throughout the day, until Charlie had made his appearance, they lay huddled in their one bed, 2 at either end, with nightcaps on to keep their heads warm, dozing the time away with nothing to do. But as soon as they heard the door opening, and heard Charlie's voice saying, "Good evening, Grandpa Joe, and Grandpa Josephine, and Grandpa George, and Grandma Georgina," then all 4 of them would suddenly sit up, with their old wrinkled faces would light up with smiles of pleasure, and the talking would begin. For they loved this little boy. He was the only bright thing in their lives, and his evening visits were something that they looked forward to all day long. Don't get ahead of the game, Miss Sonia. Jeez Louise. Good evening, Miss Hunt. Yes, yes, yes. Well, we'll have to figure out how to be singing some of the songs and digging up the photographs of myself and my 2 friends at Burning Man being Oompa Loompas. Yes, I was an Oompa Loompa, and you too could probably be an Oompa Loompa. I think that would be a rather fantastic direct action of some sort. Let's see. He was only the bright thing in their lives, and they sort of looked forward to it all day long. Often Charlie's mother and father would come in as well and stand by the door, listening to the stories that the old people told, and thus, for perhaps half an hour every night, this room would become a happy place, and the whole family would forget that it was hungry and very, very poor. One evening, when Charlie went in to see his grandparents, he said to them, "Is it really true that Wonka's chocolate factory is the biggest in the world?" True? All cried all four of them at once. Of course it's true. Good heavens! Didn't you know that? It's about 50 times as big as any other. And is Mr. Willy Wonka really the cleverest chocolate maker in the world? My dear boy, said Grandpa Joe, raising himself up, Mr. Willy Wonka is the most amazing and most fantastic, most extraordinary chocolate maker the world has ever seen. I thought everybody knew that. I knew he was famous, Grandpa Joe, and I knew he was very clever. Clever? He's more than that. He's a magician with chocolate. He can make anything he wants. Isn't that a fact, my dears? The three other old people nodded their heads slowly up and down and said, Absolutely true, just as true as can be. And Grandpa Joe said, You mean to say I've never told you about Mr. Willy Wonka and his factory? Never, said Charlie. Good heavens above, I don't know what's the matter with me. Will you tell me now, please, Grandpa Joe, please? I certainly will. Sit down beside me on the bed, my dear, and listen carefully. Grandpa Joe was the oldest of the four grandparents. He was 96 and a half, and that is just about as old as anybody can be. Like all extremely old people, he was delicate and weak, and throughout the day he spoke very little. But in the evenings, when Charlie, his beloved grandson, was in the room, he seemed some marvelous way to grow quite young again, and felt all his tiredness fell away from him, and he became as eager and as excited as a young boy. Oh, what a man he is, this Mr. Willy Wonka, cried Grandpa Joe. Did you know, for example, that he was himself invented more than 200 new kinds of chocolate bars, each with a different centre, each far sweeter and creamier, more delicious than anything the other chocolate factories can make? Perfectly true, said Grandma Josephine, and he sends them all to the four corners of the earth. Isn't that right, Grandpa Joe? It is, my dear, and to all things and presidents of the world as well. But it isn't only chocolate bars that he makes. Oh, dear me, no. He has some really fantastic inventions up his sleeves, that Mr. Willy Wonka has. Did you know that he's invented a way of making chocolate ice cream so that it stays cold for hours and hours without being in the refrigerator? You can even leave it lying in the sun all morning on a hot day and it won't go runny. Not sure I'd want to eat that. That's a lot of agar. Good evening, Miss Ollendorf. We have Gulfport, Florida, in the house. Well, that's impossible, said Charlie. Of course it's impossible. It's completely absurd, but Mr. Willy Wonka has done it. Quite right, the others agreed. Mr. Wonka has done it. He's done it. Of course he has. And then again, Grandpa Joe went on, speaking very slowly, so now that Charlie wouldn't miss a word, Mr. Willy Wonka can make marshmallows that taste of violets, and rich caramels that change color every 10 seconds as you suck on them, and little feathery sweets that melt away deliciously the moment that you put them between your lips. He can make chewing gum that never loses its taste, and sugar balloons that you can blow up to enormous sizes before you pop them with a pin and gobble them up. And by a most secret method, he can make a lovely blue bird's eggs with black spots on them. And when you put one of these in your mouth, it gradually gets smaller and smaller until suddenly there is nothing left except a tiny little pink sugar baby bird sitting on the tip of your tongue. Oh, my goodness! Grandpa Joe paused and ran the point of his tongue. It makes my mouth water just thinking about it. Mine too, but please do go on. While they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, Charlie's mother and father, had come quietly into the room, and now both were standing just inside the door, listening.
Tell Charlie about the crazy Indian prince. He'd like to hear that one, said Josephine.
You mean Prince Pondicherry? Completely dotty, said Grandpa George. Yes, but very rich, said Georgina.
What did he do? Asked Charlie eagerly.
Listen, I'll tell you. Chapter 3. Mr. Wonka and the Indian Prince. Prince Pondicherry wrote a letter to Mr. Willy Wonka, said Grandpa Joe, and asked him to come all the way out to India and build him a colossal palace entirely out of chocolate. Did Mr. Wonka do it, Grandpa? He did indeed, and what a palace it was! It had 100 rooms, and everything was made of dark chocolate or light chocolate. The bricks were chocolate, and the cement holding them together was chocolate, and the windows were chocolate, and all the walls and the ceilings were made of chocolate. So there were carpets and pictures and the furniture and the beds, and when you turned on the taps in the bathroom, hot chocolate came pouring out of the tap. When it was finished, Mr. Wonka said to Prince Pondicherry, "I warn you. I thought it won't last long, so you'd better start eating it right away." "Nonsense," shouted the prince. "I'm not going to eat my palace. I'm not even going to nibble the staircase or lick the walls. I'm going to live in it." But Mr. Wonka was right, of course, because very soon after this came a very hot day, and if you've ever been to India, you know how hot it actually gets. And if you have been to India, or if you haven't been, you know that it's easily, not even monsoon season, it easily gets up to at least 100 to 104 daily basis. Without a lot of wax, yes, wax in your chocolate, it will melt. That's the problem. But Mr. Wonka was right, of course, because soon after this there came a very hot day with a boiling sun, as if the sun wouldn't be boiling at one point. Never mind, it's a story. And the whole palace began to melt, and then it sank slowly to the ground, and the crazy prince, who was dozing in the living room at the time, woke himself up to find himself swimming around in a huge, brown, sticky lake of chocolate. Little Charlie sat very still on the edge of the bed, staring at his grandfather. Charlie's face was bright, and his eyes were stretched so wide you could see the whites all round. "Is it all really true? Or are you pulling my leg?" "It's true!" cried all four of them. "Of course it's true. Ask anyone you like." And I'll tell you something else that's true. Nobody ever comes out.
Out of where?
And nobody ever goes in.
In where?
Wonka's factory, of course.
Grandpa, what do you mean?
I mean workers, Charlie.
Workers?
All factories have workers streaming in and out of the gates in the mornings and in the evenings. Except Wonka's. Have you ever seen a single person going into that place or coming out? Little Charlie slowly looked around at each of the four old faces, one after another, and they all looked back at him. They were friendly, smiling faces, but they were also quite serious. There was no sign of joking or leg-pulling on any of them. "Well, have you?"
I really don't know, Grandpa. Whenever I walk past the factory, the gates seem to be closed."
"Exactly."
"But there must be some people working in there."
"Not people, Charlie. Not ordinary people, anyway."
"Then who?"
That is, you see, that's another of Mr. Willy Wonka's cleverness.
"Charlie, dear," said Mrs. Bucket, "it's time for bed. That's enough for tonight." "But, Mother, I must hear—" "Tomorrow, darling."
"That's right. I'll tell you the rest of it tomorrow evening. Good night, Charlie," said Uncle Joe. This is a lot of fun to read. Oh, man. That's so fun I even forgot my glasses tonight. What can I say? But hello, Leslie, hello, Wendy, and hello, Bird. Yay! Everyone's getting involved tonight. Do you like my new backdrop? I hope it's working out all right. Chapter 4. The Secret Workers. The next evening, Grandpa Joe went on with his story. "You see, Charlie, Not so very long ago, there used to be thousands of people working in Mr. Wonka's factory. Then, one day, all of a sudden, Mr. Wonka had to ask every single one of them to leave, to go home, and never come back.
But why?
Because of spies.
Spies?
Yes. All the other chocolate makers, you see, had begun to grow jealous of the wonderful sweets which Mr. Wonka was making, and they started sending in spies to steal his secret recipes. The spies took jobs in the Wonka factory, pretending that they were ordinary workers, and while they were there, each one of them found out exactly how a certain special thing was made.
And did they go back to their own factories and tell?
They must have, because soon after that, Fickelgruber's factory started making an ice cream that would never melt, and even in the hottest sun, and then Mr. Prodnose's factory came out with a chewing gum that never lost its flavour, however much you chewed it. And then Mr. Slugworth's factory began making sugar balloons that you could blow up to huge sizes before you popped them with a pin and gobbled them up. And so on, and so on. And Mr. Wonka tore his beard and shouted, "This is terrible! I shall be ruined! There are spies everywhere! I shall have to close the factory!"
But he didn't do that.
Oh, yes, he did. He told all the workers that he was sorry, but that they would have to go home. And then he shut the main gates and fastened it with a chain. And suddenly, Wonka's giant chocolate factory became silent and deserted. The chimney stopped smoking, the machine stopped whirring, and from then on, not a single chocolate or sweet was made. Not a soul went in or out, and even Mr. Willy Wonka himself disappeared completely. Side note, that's an interesting consequence of certain kinds of capitalist espionage. Power. Can't you just be nice about it, please? Months and months went by, and still the factory remained closed, and everybody said, "Poor Mr. Wonka, he was so nice, and he made such marvellous things, but he's finished now. It's all over." Then something astonishing happened. One day, early in the morning, thin columns of white smoke seemed to be coming out of the tops of the tall chimneys of the factory. People in the town stopped and stared. "Someone's lit the furnace. What's going on? Someone's lit the furnaces. Mr. Wonka must be opening up again." They ran to the gates, expecting to see them wide open, Mr. Wonka standing there to welcome his workers back to work. But no, the iron gates were still locked and chained, securely as ever, and Mr. Wonka was nowhere to be seen. But the factory was working, the people shouted. "Listen, you can hear the machines. They're all whirring again, and you can smell the smell of melting chocolate in the air." Grandpa Joe leaned forward and laid a long, bony finger on Charlie's knee, and he said softly, "But the most mysterious of all, Charlie, were the shadows in the windows of the factory. The people standing on the street outside could see small, dark shadows moving about behind the frosted glass windows."
"Shadows of whom?"
That's exactly what everybody else wanted to know. "The place is full of workers," the people shouted, "but no one's gone in. The gates are locked. It's crazy. Nobody ever comes out either." But there's no question at all that the factory is running, and it's gone on running ever since, for these last 10 years. What's more, the chocolates and the sweets has been turning out to become more fantastic and delicious all the time. And of course now when Mr. Wonka invents something new and wonderful and sweet, and neither Mr. Fickelburger, nor Mr. Prodnose, nor Mr. Slugworth, nor anybody else is able to copy it. Now spies can go into the factory to find out how it's made.
"But, Grandpa, who's Mr. Wonka using to do all the work in the factory?"
"Nobody knows, Charlie."
"But that's absurd. Hasn't anyone asked Mr. Wonka?"
"Nobody sees him anymore. He's never comes out. The only things that come out of the place are chocolates and sweets. They come out through a special trap door in the wall, all packed and addressed, and they're picked up every day by postal trucks."
But, Grandpa, what sort of people are they that work in there?
My dear boy, that is one of the great mysteries of the chocolate-making world. We know one only thing about them, that they are very small. The faint shadows that sometimes appear behind the windows, especially late at night when the lights are on, are those of tiny people, people no taller than my knee. There aren't any such people, said Charlie. Just then, Mr. Bucket, Charlie's father, came into the room. He was home from the toothpaste factory, and he was waving an evening newspaper rather excitedly. "Have you heard the news? Here's the headline. Wonka factory to be opened at last to a lucky few." Chapter 5. The Golden Tickets. You mean people are actually going to be allowed to go inside the factory? Read it to us, what it says, quickly. All right, let's see. Here goes Mr. Bucket, smoothing out. All right, listen. Evening bulletin. Oh, let's see. Mr. Willy Wonka, a confectionery genius for whom nobody has seen in the last 10 years, sent out the following notice today. I, Willy Wonka, have decided to allow 5 children, just 5, mind you, and no more, to visit my factory this year. These lucky 5 will be shown round personally by me, and they will be allowed to see all the secrets and the magics of my factory. Then, at the end of the tour, as a special present, all of them will be given enough chocolates and sweets to last them for the rest of their lives. So, watch out for the golden tickets. 5 golden tickets have been printed on golden paper, and that these 5 golden tickets have been hidden underneath the ordinary wrapping paper of 5 ordinary bars of chocolate. These 5 chocolate bars may be anywhere, in any shop, on any street, in any town, in any country in the world, upon any counter where Wonka sweets are sold. And the 5 lucky finders of these 5 golden tickets are the only ones who will be allowed to visit my factory to see what it's like inside. Good luck to you all, and happy hunting. Signed, Willy Wonka. The man's dotty, said Josephine. He's brilliant, said Grandpa Joe. He's a magician. You just imagine what will happen now. The whole world will be searching for those golden tickets. Everyone will be buying Wonka chocolate bars in the hope of finding one. He'll sell more than ever before. Oh, how exciting it would be to find one. Wow. And all the chocolate sweets that you could eat for the rest of your life for free, said Grandpa George. Just imagine that. Yeah. They'll have to deliver them in a truck, said Georgina. It makes me quite ill just to think of it, said Josephine. Nonsense, said Grandpa Joe. Wouldn't it be something, Charlie, to open a bar of chocolate and see a golden ticket glistening inside? Certainly would be, Grandpa, but there isn't a hope. I only get 1 bar a year. You never know, darling. Your birthday's next week. You have as much a chance as anybody else, said Georgina. I'm afraid that simply isn't true. The kids who are going to find the golden tickets are the ones who can afford to buy bars of chocolate every day. Our Charlie only gets once a year. There isn't any hope, said Grandpa George. Chapter 6. The First 2 Finders. The very next day, the first golden ticket was found. The finder was a boy called Augustus Gloop, and Mr. Bucket's evening newspaper carried a large picture of him on the front page. The picture showed a 9-year-old boy who was enormously fat, that he looked as though he had been blown up with a powerful pump. Oofda! The great flabby folds of fat bulged out from every part of his body, and his face was like a monstrous ball of dough with 2 small, greedy, curranty eyes peering out upon the rest of the world. Curranty being currants, which is the English version of a raisin. They seem to prefer currants over raisins, and I do too, because raisins are kind of blah, whereas currants are much more of an interesting flavour. And, by the way, currant syrup makes an excellent afternoon drink. Mix it with a bit of Gin, perhaps. Currant juice, currant soda. Yes. The town in which Augustus Goop lived, what the newspaper said, had gone wild with excitement over their hero. Flags were flying from all the windows, and children had all been given a holiday from school, and a parade was being organized in honor of the famous youth. "I just knew Augustus would find a golden ticket," his mother said, and told the newspaper. "He eats so many bars of chocolate a day that it was almost impossible for him not to find one. Eating is his hobby, and he oh, God. And he's still interested in. It's all he's interested in. But still, that's better than being a hooligan and shooting off zip guns and the like in his spare time, isn't it? And what I always say is, he wouldn't go on eating like this until he needed nourishment, wouldn't he? It's all vitamins anyway. What a thrill to be visit him to Mr. Wonka's marvelous factory. We're just going to be proud as anything." "What a revolting woman," said Grandma Josephine. "What a repulsive boy," said Grandma Georgina. "Only 4 golden tickets left. I wonder who'll get those," said George. And now the whole country, indeed the whole world, seemed suddenly to be caught up in the mad chocolate-buying spree, everybody searching frantically for those precious 4 remaining tickets. Fully grown woman was seen going into sweet shops and buying 10 Wonka bars at a time, and then tearing off the wrappers on the spot and peering eagerly underneath for a glint of golden paper. Children were taking hammers and smashing their piggy banks and running out to the shops with handfuls of money. In one city, a famous gangster robbed a bank of thousands of pounds and spent the whole lot on Wonka bars on the same afternoon. And when the police entered his house to arrest him, they found him sitting on the floor amidst mountains of chocolate, ripped off wrappers with the blade of a long dagger. In far-off Russia, a woman called Charlotte Russe claimed to have found one, the second ticket, but it turned out to be a clever fake. The famous English scientist Professor Foulbody invented a machine which would tell you at once, without opening the wrapper of a bar of chocolate, whether or not there was a golden ticket inside. The machine had a mechanical arm that shot out with a tremendous force, grabbed a hold of anything that would have the slightest bit of gold inside it, and for a moment it looked like the answer to everything. But unfortunately, while the professor was showing off the machine to the public at the sweet counter of a large department store, the mechanical arm shot out and made a grab for the gold filling in the back tooth of a duchess who was standing nearby. Oh, no. It was an ugly scene, and the machine was smashed by the crowd. "Don't mess with the duchess. Don't you do it." Suddenly, on the day before Charlie Bucket's birthday, the newspapers announced that the second golden ticket had been found. The lucky person was a small girl called Veruca Salt, who lived with her rich parents in a great city far, far away. Once again, Mr. Bucket's evening newspaper carried a big picture of the finder. She was sitting between her beaming father and mother in the living room of their house, waving the golden ticket above her head and grinning from ear to ear. Veruca's father, Mr. Salt, had eagerly explained to the newspapermen exactly how the ticket was found. "You see, boys, as soon as my little girl told me that she simply had to have one of those golden tickets, I went into the town and started buying up all the Wonka bars I could lay my hands on. Thousands of them. I must have bought hundreds of thousands, and then I had them all loaded onto a truck, and sent them directly to my own factory. I'm in the peanut business, you see, and I've got about 100 women working for me all at my place, shelling peanuts for roasting and salting. And that's what they do all day long, those women. They sit there shelling peanuts. So I says to them, 'Okay, girls, from now on you can stop shelling peanuts and start shelling the wrappers off these chocolate bars instead.' And I did. And I had every worker in the place yanking the paper off those bars of chocolate, full speed ahead, from morning till night. But 3 days went by, and we had no luck. Oh, it was terrible. My little Veruca got more and more upset each day, and every time I went home she would scream at me, 'Where's my golden ticket? I want my golden ticket!' And she would lie for hours on the floor, kicking and yelling in the most disturbing way. Well, I just hated to see my little girl feeling all unhappy like that, so I vowed I would keep up on the search until I got her what she wanted, and then, suddenly, On the evenings of the fourth day, one of my women workers yelled, "I've got it! A golden ticket!" And I said, "Give it to me, quick!" And she did, and I rushed home and gave it to my darling Veruca. And now she's all smiles, and we have a happy home once again.
"That's even worse than the fat boy," said Grandma Josephine.
"She really needs a good spanking,"
said Georgina.
"I don't think it's the girl's father played it quite fair, do you, Grandpa?" said Charlie.
"He spoils her, and no good can ever come of spoiling a child like that, Charlie. Mark my words."
"Come to bed, darling," said Charlie's mother. "Tomorrow's your birthday, and don't forget it. So I'll expect you'll be up early to receive your present."
A Wonka chocolate bar. It's a Wonka chocolate bar, isn't it?
"Yes, my love. Of course it is." "Oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if I found the third golden ticket inside?"
Bring it in here when you get it, son, and then we can all watch you taking off the wrapper. Chapter 7. Charlie's Birthday. "Happy birthday!" cried the four grandparents as Charlie came into the room there early the next morning. Charlie smiled nervously, sat down on the edge of the bed. He was holding his present, his only present, very carefully in his two hands. "Wonka's Whipple Scrumpish Fudge Mallow Delight," it said on the wrapper. The four old people, two at either end of the bed, propped themselves up on their pillows and stared with anxious eyes at the bar of chocolate in Charlie's hands. Mr. and Mrs. Bucket came in and stood at the foot of the bed, watching Charlie. The room became silent. Everybody was waiting now for Charlie to start opening his present. Charlie looked down at the bar of chocolate. He ran his fingers slowly back and forth along the length of it, stroking it lovingly in the shining paper wrapping, made sharp little crackly noises in the quiet room. Then Mrs. Bucket said gently, "You mustn't be too disappointed, my darling, if you don't find what you're looking for underneath the wrapper. Really can't expect to be as lucky as all that." "She's quite right," said Mr. Bucket. Charlie said nothing.
"After all, in the whole wide world, there are only 3 tickets left to be found," said Josephine reassuringly. "The thing to remember is that whatever happens, you'll still have a bar of chocolate," said Georgina.
"Wonka's Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Mallow Delight," cried Grandpa George. "It's the best of them all. You'll just love it."
"Yes, I know."
"Oh, just forget about all those golden tickets and enjoy the chocolate," said Grandpa Joe. "Why don't you just do that?" They all knew it was ridiculous to expect this one poor little bar of chocolate to have a magic ticket inside it, and they were all trying as gently and as kindly as they could to prepare Charlie for the disappointment. But there was one other thing that the grown-ups also knew, and it was this, that however small the chance might be of striking it lucky, the chance was there. The chance had to be there. This particular bar of chocolate had as much a chance as any other of having a golden ticket. And that was why all the grandparents and the parents in the room were actually just as tense and excited as Charlie was, although they were pretending to be very calm. "You'd better go ahead and open it up, or you'll be late for school," said Grandpa Joe. "You might as well get it over with," said Grandpa George.
"Open it, my dear. Please open it. You're making me jumpy."
Very slowly, Charlie's fingers began to tear open one small corner of the wrapping paper. The old people in the bed all leaned forward, craning their scraggy necks. Then, suddenly, as though he couldn't bear the suspense any longer, Charlie tore open the wrapper right down the middle, and on his lap there fell a light brown, creamy-coloured bar of chocolate. There was no sign of a golden ticket anywhere. "Well, that's that. It's just what we expected." Charlie looked up. The 4 kind old faces were watching him intently from the bed. He smiled at them, a small, sad smile. Then he shrugged his shoulders and picked up the chocolate bar and held it out to his mother. "Here, Mother, have a bit. We'll share it. I want everybody to taste it." "Certainly not." And all the other cries, "No, no, we wouldn't dream of it. It's all yours." "Please, please," begged Charlie, offering it to Grandpa Joe and to anyone else. But neither he nor anyone else would even take a tiny bit. "It's time to go to school, my darling," she said, putting her arm around Charlie's skinny shoulders. "Come on, or you'll be late." Chapter 8. 2 more golden tickets found. That evening, Mr. Bucket's newspaper announced the finding of not only the 3rd golden ticket, but the 4th as well. "2 golden tickets found today," screamed the headlines. "Only 1 more left." "All right," said Grandpa Joe, when the whole family was gathered round in the old people's room after supper. "Let's hear who found them." "The 3rd ticket," said Mr. Bucket, holding the newspaper up close to his face because his eyes were bad and he couldn't afford glasses. "The 3rd ticket was found by a Miss Violet Beauregard. There was a great excitement in the Beauregard household when our reporter arrived to interview the lucky young lady. Cameras were clicking and flashbulbs were flashing, and people were pushing around and jostling and trying to get a bit closer to the famous girl. And the famous girl was standing on a chair in the living room, waving the golden ticket madly at arm's length as though she was flagging a taxi. She was talking very fast and very loudly to everyone, but it was not easy to hear all that because she was chewing so ferociously upon a piece of gum at the same time. "I'm a gum chewer normally, but when I heard about the ticket with Mr. Wonka's, I gave up gum chewing and started talking about it in the hopes of striking it lucky. Now, of course, I'm back on gum. I just adore gum. I can't do much without it. I munch it all day long, except for a few minutes in meal times when I take it out and stick it behind my ear for safekeeping. To tell you the truth, I simply wouldn't feel comfortable if I didn't have a little wedge of gum to chew on every moment of the day. Can we say oral fixation? I really wouldn't. My mother says it's not just ladylike, it's totally an oral fixation. And it looks ugly to see a girl's jaw going up and down, doing all the same, but I don't agree. I like to, and it's who does she criticize me? Anyway, because if you ask me, I'd say that her jaws are going up and down just almost as much as mine from yelling at me every minute of the day." "Now, Violet," Mrs. Beauregard, "Now, Violet," Mrs. Beauregard said from the far corner of the room where she was standing on the piano to avoid being trampled by the mob. "All right, Mother, keep your hair on." And now she went on, turning to reporters again. "It may interest you to know that this piece of gum I've been chewing on right at this moment is one I've been working on for over 3 months solid. That's a record, that is. It's been the record that's been held by my best friend Cornelia Prinsmedel. And when she was furious in my most treasured possessions. Now, this piece of gum. At night, I just stick it on the end of one of the bedposts, as is good to do every in the mornings, and a bit hard at first, but man, so it softens up again, and I've given it a few good chews. Before I started chewing for the world record, I used to change my piece of gum once a day, and I used to do it in our lift on the way home from school, lift being an elevator. Why the lift? Because I liked sticking the gooey piece that I just finished with one to the one of the control buttons, and then the next person who came along to press the button got my old gum and the end as her finger. Ha ha! And that's what a racket they kicked up, some of them. You get the best results from the women who have expensive gloves on. Oh yes, I'm thrilled to be going on to Mr. Wonka's factory, and I understand that afterwards he's going to give me enough gum to last me the rest of my life. Whee! Hooray! "Beastly girl," said Grandma Josephine. "Despicable," said Georgina. "She'll come to a sticky end one day chewing all that gum, if she doesn't." "And who got the 4th ticket?" Charlie asked. Now, let me see, said Mr. Bucket, peering at the newspaper again. Ah, yes, here we are, the fourth golden ticket, he read. It was found by a boy called Mike TV. Ah, another bad lot, I'll be bound. Don't interrupt, Grandma, said Mrs. Bucket. The TV household, said Mr. Bucket, going on with his reading, was crammed like all the others with excited visitors when our reporter arrived, but young Mike TV, the lucky winner, seemed extremely annoyed at the whole business. Can't you fools see I'm watching television? I just wish you wouldn't interrupt. The 9-year-old boy was seated before an enormous television set with his eyes glued to the screen, and he was watching a film in which one of a bunch of gangsters was shooting up another bunch of gangsters with machine guns. Mike TV himself had no less than 18 toy pistols of varying sizes hanging from belts around his body, and every now and again he would leap up in the air and fire off half a dozen rounds from one another of these weapons. Remember those caps with the red? You could smell the gunpowder. Cap, pat, 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 pat. It would just make that little puff of smoke. Yeah, if you know what I'm talking about. Wow. Do they even make those things anymore? I wonder. Can you buy cap guns? I mean, there's plenty of other things that were equally dangerous nowadays, but I guess you could. Yeah, black cats. Those were great. Quiet, he shouted. Didn't I tell you not to interrupt? This show's an absolute whiz-banger. It's terrific. I watch it every day, and I watch them all every day. And the rotten ones, I mean, there's no shooting. I like the gangsters best. They're terrific, those gangsters, especially when they start pumping each other full of lead or flashing those old stilettos, giving each other the 1, 2, 3 with their knuckle dusters. Gosh, I wouldn't lie. I wouldn't give to doing that myself. It's the life, I tell you. It's terrific. That's quite enough. I can't bear to listen to it. Nor me, said Georgina. Do all those children behave like this nowadays? All these brats have been hearing about this. Of course not, Mr. Bucket said, smiling at the old lady. Some do, some of course. In fact, quite a lot of them do, but not all. And now there's only one ticket left, said Grandpa George. Quite so, said Georgina. And just as sure as I'll be having cabbage soup for supper tomorrow, that ticket will go to some nasty little beast who doesn't deserve it. Chapter 9. Grandpa Joe takes a gamble. All right, I'll just keep going, because it's kind of fun. The next day, when Charlie came home from school and went to see his grandparents, he found that only Grandpa Joe was awake. The other 3 were all snoring loudly. Shh, whispered Grandpa Joe. Charlie tiptoed over and stood beside the bed. The old man gave Charlie a sly grin, and then he started rummaging under his pillow with one hand, and then his hand came out again, and there was an ancient leather purse clutched in his fingers. Under cover of the bedclothes, the old man opened up the purse and tipped it upside down. Out fell a single silver sixpence. It's my secret hoard. The others don't know I've got it. And now, you and I are going to go have one more fling at finding that lost ticket. How about it, eh? You'll have to help me. Are you sure you want to spend your money on that, Grandpa? Charlie whispered. Of course I'm sure. Don't stand there arguing with me. I'm as keen as you are to find that ticket. Here, take the money. Run down to the street, to the nearest shop, and buy the first Wonka bar you see. Bring it straight back to me. We'll open it together. Charlie took the silver coin, slipped quickly out of the room, and in 5 minutes he was back. Have you got it? His eyes were shining with excitement. Charlie nodded and held out the bar of chocolate. Wonka's Nutty Crunch Surprise, it said on the wrapper. Good. Now, come over here and sit close to me and we'll open it together. You ready? Yes, I'm ready. All right. You tear off the first bit. No, you do it. You do it all. The old man's fingers were trembling most terribly as they fumbled with the wrapper. We don't have a hope, really, he whispered, giggling. But you know we don't have a hope, don't you? Yes, I know that. They looked at each other and both started giggling nervously. Mind you, there is one tiny chance. It might be the one, don't you agree?
Yes, of course. Why don't you open it, Grandpa?
All in good time, my boy, all in good time.
Which end do you think I ought to open first? That corner, the one furthest from you. Just tear off a tiny little bit, but not quite enough for us to see anything.
Like that?
Yes, now a little more.
You finish it. I'm too nervous.
No, Grandpa, you must do it yourself.
Very well, then. Here goes. And he tore off the wrapper. They both stared at what lay underneath. It was a bar of chocolate and nothing else. All at once, they both saw the funny side of the whole thing, and they burst into peals of laughter.
What on earth's going on?
Cried Grandma Josephine, waking up suddenly. Oh, nothing. You go on back to sleep. Chapter 10. The family begins to starve. During the next 2 weeks, the weather turned very cold. First came the snow. It began very suddenly one morning, just as Charlie Bucket was getting dressed for school, and standing by the window he saw huge flakes drifting slowly down out of an icy sky, the color of steel. By evening it lay 4 feet deep round the tiny house, and Mr. Bucket had to dig a path from the front door to the road. After the snow there came a freezing gale that blew for days, and days without stopping, and oh, how bitter cold it was. Everything that Charlie touched seemed to be made of ice, and each time he stepped outside the door, the wind was like a knife on his cheek. Inside the house, little jets of freezing air came rushing in through the sides of the windows and under the doors, and there was no place to go to escape them. The 4 old ones lay silent and huddled in their bed, trying to keep the cold out of their bones. The excitement over the golden tickets had long been forgotten. Nobody in the family gave a thought now to anything except the 2 vital problems, to keep warm and trying to get enough to eat. There is something about very cold weather that gives one an enormous appetite. Most of us find ourselves beginning to crave rich, steaming stews and hot apple pies, and all kinds of delicious, warming dishes, and because we are all a great deal luckier than we realize, we usually get what we want, or near enough. But Charlie Bucket never got what he wanted because his family couldn't afford it, and as the cold weather went on and on, he became ravenously and desperately hungry. Both bars of chocolate, the birthday one and the one that Grandpa Joe had bought, had long since been nibbled away. And all he got now were those thin, cabbagey meals 3 times a day. Then, all at once, the meals became even thinner. The reason for this was that the toothpaste factory, that the place where Mr. Bucket had his work, suddenly went bust and had to close down. Quickly, Mr. Bucket tried to get another job, but he had no luck, and in the end, the only way in which he managed to earn a few pennies was by shoveling snow in the streets. But it wasn't enough to buy even a quarter of the food that the 7 people actually needed. The situation became desperate. Breakfast was a single slice of bread for each person now, and lunch was maybe half a boiled potato. Slowly but surely, everybody in the house began to starve. And every day, little Charlie Bucket, trudging through the snow on his way to school, would have to pass Mr. Willy Wonka's giant chocolate factory. And every day he came near to it, he would lift up his small nose high in the air and sniff the wonderful, sweet smell of melting chocolate. Sometimes he would stand motionless outside the gates for several minutes on end, taking in deep, swallowing breaths as though he were trying to eat the smell itself. "That child," said Grandpa Joe, poking his head up from underneath the blanket one icy morning, "that child's got to have more food. It doesn't matter about us. We're too old to bother with. And he's a growing boy. He can't go on looking like this. He's beginning to look like a skeleton."
What can one do? He refuses to take any of ours. I hear his mother tried to slip her own piece of bread onto his plate at breakfast in the morning, but he wouldn't touch it. He made her take it back."
"He's a fine little fellow. He deserves better than this." The cruel weather went on and on. And every day Charlie Bucket grew thinner and thinner. His face had become frighteningly white and pinched, and the skin was drawn so tightly over the cheeks that you could see the shapes of the bones underneath, and it seemed doubtful whether he would go on much longer than this without becoming dangerously ill. And now, very calmly, with the curious wisdom that seems to come so often with small children in times of hardship, he began to make little changes here and there in some of the things that he did, so as to save his strength. In the mornings he left the house 10 minutes earlier so that he could walk slowly to school without ever having to run. He sat quietly in the classroom during break, resting himself, while the others rushed outdoors and threw snowballs and wrestled in the snow. Everything he did now, he did slowly and carefully to prevent exhaustion. Then, one afternoon, walking back home with the icy wind in his face, and incidentally feeling hungrier than he had ever felt before, his eye was caught suddenly by something silvery lying in the gutter, in the snow. Charlie stepped off the curb and bent down to examine it. Part of it was buried under the snow, but he saw at once what it was. It was a 50-cent piece. 50 pence. Quickly he looked around him. Had somebody dropped it? No. That was impossible because of the way it was buried. Several people went hurrying past him on the pavement, their chins sunk deep into the collars of their coats, their feet crunching in the snow. None of them was searching for any money. None of them was taking the slightest notice of a small boy crouching in the gutter. Then, was it his 50 pence? Could he have it? Carefully, Charlie pulled it out from under the snow. It was damp and dirty, but otherwise perfect. A whole 50 pence! He held it tightly between his shivering fingers, gazing down at it. It meant one thing to him in that moment, only one thing. It meant food. Automatically, Charlie turned and began moving towards the nearest shop. It was only 10 paces away. It was a newspaper and stationery shop, the kind that sells almost everything, including sweets and cigars and newspapers and everything. And what would he do? He whispered to himself. He would buy one luscious bar of chocolate and eat it all up, every bit of it, right then and there, and the rest of the money he could take straight back home and give to his mother. Chapter 11. The Miracle. Charlie entered the shop and laid the damp 50 pence on the counter. "One Wonka Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Mallow Delight," he said, remembering how much he had loved the one he had had on his birthday. I think if there's anyone, quick little side note, we should look around and see if anyone's actually been able to make this, because it's a Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Mallow Delight, which I would think would be either a semi-sweet chocolate or a dark chocolate, in order to counter the fudge. But then you could possibly make a milky fudge and fudge mallow, and so I would think that I would put the fudge on top of the mallow and then surround that with I'm salivating already. Someone has had to have made it already, so let's take a look around and see if we can't find it. Someone that has made the Whipple Scrumptious Fudge Mallow Delight. The man behind the counter looked fat and well-fed. He had big lips and fat cheeks and a very fat neck. The fat around his neck bulged out round the top of his collar like a rubber ring. He turned and reached behind him for the chocolate bar, and then he turned around back again and handed it to Charlie. Charlie grabbed it and quickly tore off the wrapper and took an enormous bite. And then he took another, and another, and oh, the joy of being able to cram large pieces of something sweet and solid into one's mouth. The sheer blissful joy of being able to fill one's mouth with solid, rich food. "You look like you wanted that one, sonny," said the shopkeeper pleasantly. Charlie nodded, his mouth bulging with chocolate. The shopkeeper put Charlie's change on the counter. "Take it easy. It'll give you a stomachache if you swallow it like that without chewing." Charlie went on wolfing the chocolate. He couldn't stop, and in less than half a minute the whole thing had disappeared down his throat. He was quite out of breath, but he felt marvelously, extraordinarily happy. Yes, we call that an insulin spike. When you're on starvation rations and you eat that much sweets and that much chocolate, it's going to throw your system into absolute bonkersville. He was quite out of breath, but he felt marvelously, extraordinarily happy. He reached out a hand to take the change. Then he paused. His eyes were just above the level of the counter. They were staring at the silver coins lying there. The coins were all 5-penny pieces. There were 9 of them altogether. Surely it wouldn't matter if he spent just one more. I think I'll have just one more of those chocolate bars. Same kind as before, please."
Why not?
The shopkeeper reached behind him, and again, taking another whipple scrumptious fudge mallow delight from the shelf, he laid it on the counter. Charlie picked it up and tore off the wrapper, and suddenly, from underneath the wrapper, there came a brilliant flash of gold. Charlie's heart stood still.
It's a golden ticket!
Screamed the shopkeeper, leaping about a foot in the air.
"You've got the golden ticket! You found the last golden ticket! Hey, would you believe it? Come here, look at this, everybody! The kid's found Wonka's last golden ticket! There it is, right in his hands!"
It seems as though the shopkeeper might be going to have a fit in my shop, too. He found it right here in my little shop. Somebody call the newspapers and get quick, let them know. Watch out, Sonny, don't tear it, unwrap it. As you unwrap it, it's precious. In a few seconds, there was a crowd of about 20 people clustering around Charlie, and many more were pushing their way in from the street. Everybody wanted to get a look at the golden ticket and the lucky finder.
"Where is it? Hold it up so all of us can see." There it is. He's holding up in his hands. You see, he's golden. You see the gold shining.
How did he manage to find it? I'd like to know, a large boy shouted angrily. 20 bars a day I've been buying for weeks and weeks. Yeah, jealousy. Just be happy with the fact that I have zero tolerance for people that are like that. Zero. Think of all the free stuff he'll be getting too. A lifetime supply. He'll need it, a skinny little shrimp, said someone else, laughing. Yeah, make fun of kids. Kids make fun of kids. That just has got to stop. That's just not an okay thing. Charlie hadn't moved. He hadn't even unwrapped the golden ticket from round the chocolate. He was standing very still, holding it tightly with both hands while the crowd pushed and shouted all round him. He felt quite dizzy. There was a peculiar floating sensation coming over him, as though he were floating up in the air like a balloon. His feet didn't seem to be touching the ground at all. He could hear his heart thumping away loudly somewhere in his throat. At that point, he became aware of a hand resting lightly on his shoulder, and when he looked up, he saw a tall man standing over him. "Listen, I'll buy it from you. I'll give you £50. How about it, eh? I'll give you a new bicycle as well, okay?"
"Are you crazy? Why, I give him £200 for that ticket. You want to sell that ticket for £200, young man?"
"That's quite enough of that," said the shopkeeper, pushing his way through the crowd and taking Charlie firmly by the arm. "Leave the kid alone, will you? Make your way there, let him out." And Charlie, he led him to the door. "Don't let anybody have it. Take it straight home quickly before you lose it. Run all the way and don't stop till you get there. Do you understand?" Charlie nodded. "You know something?" The shopkeeper said, pausing a moment and smiling at Charlie. "I have a feeling you needed a break like this. I'm awfully glad you've got it. Good luck to you, Sonny." Now that's a good person. "Thank you," And off Charlie went. He took off, running through the snow as fast as his little legs would go. And as he flew past Mr. Willy Wonka's factory, he turned and waved at it and sang out, "I'll be seeing you! I'll be seeing you!" And 5 minutes later, he arrived at his own home. Chapter 12. What it said on the golden ticket. Charlie burst into the front door, shouting, "Mother! Mother! Mother!" Mrs. Bucket was in the old grandparents' room serving them their evening soup. "Mother! Mother!" He came rushing in like a hurricane. "Look, I've got it! Look, Mother, I've the last golden ticket. It's mine. I found some money in the street, and I bought 2 bars of chocolate. And the second one had the golden ticket. And there were crowds of people all around me wanting to see it, and the shopkeeper rescued me. And I went all the way home, and here it is. It's the 5th golden ticket, Mother, and I found it." Mrs. Bucket simply stood and stared, while the 4 old grandparents, who were sitting up in bed balancing bowls of soup on their laps, all dropped their spoons with a clatter and froze against their pillows. For about 10 seconds there was absolute silence in the room. Nobody dared to speak or move. It was a magic moment. Then, very softly, Grandpa Joe, "You're pulling our legs, Charlie, aren't you? You're having a little joke?" "I'm not. Look." Grandpa Joe leaned forward and took a close look, his nose almost touching the ticket. The others watched him, waiting for the verdict. Then, very slowly, with a slow and marvelous grin spreading all over his face, Grandpa Joe lifted his head and looked straight at Charlie. The color was rushing into his cheeks, and his eyes were wide open, shining with joy. And in the center of each eye, right in the very center in the black pupil, a little spark of wild excitement was slowly dancing. Then the old man took a deep breath, and suddenly, without warning whatsoever, an explosion seemed to take place inside of him. He threw up his arms. Yippee! And at the same time, his long, bony body rose up out of the bed, and his bowl of soup went flying in the face of Grandma Josephine. And in one fantastic leap, this old fellow of 96 and a half, who hadn't been out of bed in the last 20 years, jumped onto the floor and started doing a dance of victory in his pajamas. Yippee! 3 cheers for Charlie! Yip, yip, hooray! At this point, the door opened, and Mr. Bucket walked in the room. He was cold and tired, and he looked it. All day long he had been shoveling snow in the streets. "Cripes! What's going on in here?" It didn't take them long to tell him what had happened. "I don't believe it. It's not possible." "Show him the ticket, Charlie. Show your father the 5th and last golden ticket in the world." "Let me see it, Charlie," said Mr. Bucket, collapsing in a chair and holding out his hand. Charlie came forward with the precious document. It was a very beautiful thing, this golden ticket, having been made so it seemed from a sheet of pure gold, hammered out to almost the thinness of paper. On one side of it, printed by some clever method in jet black letters, was the invitation itself, from Mr. Wonka. "Read it aloud. Let's all hear exactly what it says." Mr. Bucket held the lovely golden ticket up close to his eyes. His hands trembled slightly, and he seemed to be overcome by the whole business. He took several deep breaths. Then he cleared his throat and said, "All right, I'll read it. Here we go. Greetings to you, the lucky finder of this golden ticket from Mr. Willy Wonka. I shake you warmly by the hand. Tremendous things are in store for you. Many wonderful surprises await you. Now, I do invite you to come to my factory and be my guest for 1 whole day. You and all others who are lucky enough to find my golden tickets. I, Willy Wonka, will conduct you round the factory myself, showing you everything that there is to see, and afterwards, when it is time to leave, you will be escorted home by a procession of large trucks. These trucks, I can promise you, will be loaded with enough delicious eatables to last you your entire household for many years. If at any time thereafter you should run out of supplies, you will only have to come back to the factory and show this golden ticket, and I shall be happy to refill your cupboard with whatever you want. In this way, you will be able to keep yourself supplied with tasty morsels for the rest of your life. But this is by no means the most exciting thing that will happen on the day of your visit. I am preparing other surprises that are even more marvelous and more fantastic for you and all my golden ticket holders. Mystic and marvelous surprises will entrance, delight, intrigue, astonish, and perplex you beyond measure. In your wildest dreams, you could not imagine such things could happen to you. Just wait and see. And now, here are your instructions. The day I have chosen for the visit is the first day in the month of February. On this day, and now no other, you must come to the factory at gates at 10 o'clock sharp in the morning. Don't be late, and you are allowed to bring with you either 1 or 2 members of your family to look after you and to ensure that you don't get into mischief. One more thing. Be certain to have this ticket with you, otherwise you will not be admitted. Signed, Willy Wonka.
The first day of February? But that's tomorrow. Today is the last day of January. I know it is.
Cripes, I think you're right. You're just in time, shouted Grandpa. There's not a moment to lose. You must start making preparations at once. Wash your face, comb your hair, scrub your hands, brush your teeth, blow your nose, cut your nails, polish your shoes, iron your shirt, and for heaven's sake, get all that mud off your pants. You must get ready, my boy. You must get ready for the biggest day of your life.
Now, don't get too overexcite yourself, Grandpa, said Mrs. Bucket, and don't fluster poor Charlie. We must try to be very calm. Now, the first thing to do and decide is, who's going to go with you to the factory?
I will, said Grandpa Joe, leaping out of bed at once. I'll take him. I'll look after him. You leave it to me.
Mrs. Bucket smiled at the old man, and then she turned to her husband and said, "How about you, dear? Don't you think you ought to go?"
"Well," said Mr. Bucket, "no, I'm not sure that I should."
"But you must."
"There's no must about it, my dear. Mind you, I'd love to go. It'd be tremendously exciting, but on the other hand, I believe it's the person who really deserves most of all is Grandpa Joe himself. He seems to know more about it than we do, provided, of course, he feels well enough."
"Yippee!"
shouted Grandpa Joe, seizing Charlie by the hands and dancing round the room.
"He certainly seems well enough," said Mrs. Bucket. "Yes, perhaps you're right after all. Perhaps Grandpa Joe should be the one to go with him. I certainly can't go myself and leave the other 3 old people alone in bed for the whole day."
"Hallelujah! Praise the Lord!"
At that point there came a loud knock on the door. The front door. Mr. Bucket went to open it, and the next moment swarms of newspapermen and photographers were pouring into the house. They had tracked down the finder of the 5th golden ticket, and now all they wanted was to get the full story for the front pages of the morning papers. For several hours there was complete pandemonium inside the little house, and it must have been nearly midnight before Mr. Bucket was able to get rid of them all, so Charlie could go to bed.